What's up, AP Human Geography students? So I'm making this video a little bit earlier than I anticipated because it's Wednesday afternoon and I'm bored waiting for parent-teacher conferences to start. So might as well knock this out and give you guys an answer key to check your work for this review. So you had to go through these slides and determine for each scenario, does it correspond to devolution, supranationalism, centripetal force, centrifugal force, nation state, or separatism. Here we go. Vojvodina. Vojvodina would be an example of devolution because in this case, the government is allowing an area or a group of people to remain autonomous. Autonomous means you retain your sovereignty. You have self-determination. You get to pick your own government in this case, and parliament, which is like our version of Congress, and their political parties. So even though it's a part of Serbia, one definition or term you should know here is province. Province is like a state to the United States. So if you're looking for an example of a province in the United States, it would be Illinois or Mississippi, Kansas, Alaska. It's just another word for region or state within a country or state. Hopefully that's not being too confusing. Anyways, one slide in, I'm already confusing you guys. So Vojvodina would be devolution. Number two, Quebec. Quebec, because the Canadian government is allowing people there to speak French, but secession has been considered in the past. Quebec would be a good example of both devolution, because the Canadian government is allowing the people to speak French and choose their religion, which is Catholic, while the rest of Canada is Protestant. So Canada or Quebec would be a good example of devolution. Let's move on to the next one. East Ukraine. East Ukraine would be an example of a centrifugal force. Separatism could also apply here because East Ukraine, this area right here in yellow, tried to break away from the rest of Ukraine and become part of Russia. This is more of a Russian nationalist area compared to the rest of the Ukraine, which tends to be Ukrainian nationalists. So this would be an example of separatism and a centrifugal force. Catalonia. Catalonia would be an example of devolution. Same reason as Vojvodina or Quebec. Even though these people tried to secede, I guess you could always say this would be separatism too, but in Catalonia, this is an autonomous region. So therefore, because it's autonomous, they get sovereignty. They are allowed to choose their own laws. This is a good example of devolution. If you wanted to look at the second part, that would be a good example of separatism. Slovenia. Slovenia would be an example of a nation state, one ethnicity, one language. Ukrainian Civil War. Ukrainian Civil War would be an example of separatism or a centrifugal force because it's a war that splits apart the country. Centrifugal force. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations would be an example of supranationalism because it's these 10 states coming together to facilitate or make trade easy between the 10 countries. So that would be supranationalism. The Arab Spring, we talked about this briefly. The Arab Spring would be an example of a centrifugal force because in this case, see if you could determine the centrifugal force. The centrifugal force are the different nationalities or ethnic groups breaking the country apart and trying to overthrow the government and make it more democratic. So the democratic movement could be the centrifugal force and causing the civil war throughout Southwest Asia, the Middle East. Scotland. Scotland voted several years ago there was a vote to the Scottish people on whether or not they should leave the United Kingdom. The vote failed. Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom, Wales, England, Northern Ireland. But this referendum would be an example of separatism because the referendum placed before the people was to secede or leave the United Kingdom. 9/11. 9/11 would be an example of a centripetal force because it's bringing people together in the United States around the 9/11 attacks. The European Union would be an example of supranationalism. Why? Because it's states coming together within Europe for a common cause, promote trade, have a common currency. Another aspect of the European Union is if you live in one of these countries, you can freely move from country to country without a passport. You can move from country to country. And so it promotes travel, promotes trade, and you can have a common currency that you can use in all of these different countries, the euro. The Basque people. The Basque people live in the Pyrenees Mountains in northern Spain. Because they are allowed to remain autonomous, this is an example of devolution. The Basque people being allowed to speak Basque and practice their own culture without being absorbed into Spanish culture and the Spanish government. Cyprus. Because Cyprus has two main ethnicities that have gone to war in the past, there's been a civil war. That would be an example of a centrifugal force. Those two ethnicities, Turkish and Greek, fighting against one another, that has led to the creation of this buffer zone that separates the two. The Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact would be an example of a centripetal force. These countries coming together in a common cause. That would be communism and the resisting democracy, resisting NATO. China. China adopting a unitary system of government, trying to bring people together. That would be a centripetal force, trying to bring people together under one government, one set of laws. So instead of having different provinces and cities and towns make their own laws, it's under one. So that would be an example of a centripetal force. South Yemen. South Yemen is an area that has been engaged in a civil war between different ethnic groups. They've also been fighting Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization. So South Yemen would be an example of separatism as these different groups are trying to break away and form their own states. The Eurozone crisis. This happened about 10 years ago now when countries were spending so much money on their economies, buildings and roads, paying for people's retirement, Social Security, medical insurance, things like that. It got to the point where they couldn't afford to pay these bills anymore. And some of these countries, such as Italy, Portugal, Greece, and Spain, went into debt. So the Eurozone crisis would be an example of a centrifugal force. The debt that caused this problem almost broke these countries apart and almost started civil wars. Denmark. Denmark would be an example of a nation state, one ethnicity, one language. Azerbaijan in Southwest Asia would be an example of a centrifugal force. These multiple ethnicities splitting apart the country. NAFTA would be an example of supranationalism, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Mexico, Canada, and the United States coming together under one common cause to promote trade. This was recently changed too, so I'll try and bring that up next week because there's been some changes to it under President Trump. And the United Nations would be an example of supranationalism. All these countries coming together to try and promote peace, prevent World War III, and then also at the same time trying to promote civil rights, equality under the law, and promote trade. But their first and foremost goal, peace, preventing another world war. Hope this was good. If there are some that you still have questions on, email me, hit me up, and enjoy your long weekend. Bye.